previous video, we looked at creating storyboards as a design element in planning our projects. What I'd like to do now is take the storyboard we created earlier to do a simple calculator. We can do addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division of two numbers, and create that project so you can see the process we would go through in developing that software. This is all about process in this video. It's not about understanding everything we're doing. It's not about mastering anything. I'm going to create some code. We'll talk about the code much later, but I will try to explain what I'm doing in the code. But I just want you to get a feel for what it's like to create a project, to develop the interface, code it, and test it. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio. The first time you launch Visual Studio, you may have to do some things as far as setting up an account. They'll need an email address for you. It can be a Gmail account, it can be a Microsoft Mail account or Microsoft account if you have one. But you're going to create an account, and you'll probably have to choose which language you prefer to work in. So choose C#. You can choose to work in any language you like within Visual Studio, but that will become the default. So to create a new project, I'm going to go to the File menu and choose New Project. And I'm going to choose Visual C#. And then I want to choose in the center here, Windows Forms App. And for CS162 AD, we're going to basically do everything as Windows Forms App, at least for the most part. Then we can give it a name. I'm going to call this Simple Calculator. I usually like to put, because I program in different languages, I like to put in parentheses CS after that for C#. I can decide where I want that to be saved. So you can click the Browse button and choose a different location if you like. And then click OK. Now it's going to create a project folder for us. That folder is going to contain several files and several subfolders, all of which are very important. And so it's important to always keep that folder together. Once that folder and the files have been created, it will launch here in the IDE our solution. And we will see in the center our form. The form is simply what we call a window. Over on the far right-hand side is our Solution Explorer, which basically gives us access to some of those files in this project. Here you see form1.cs. CS stands for C#. This is this form, and you'll notice it has a little arrow here. We can launch it. There's the design, which is what we're seeing, and then we'll start writing some code for this that goes into the form1.cs. Down below are the properties. We mentioned that every object has properties, methods, and events. And the properties define the behavior and look of our form. So if I choose our form, I can see the properties for that form here in the window. At the top of the properties window, there are some buttons. I can view the properties by category. Well, I find that kind of hard to use, and especially starting out, you would not necessarily know what category a particular property occurs in. So I prefer the second option, which is to alphabetize it. And it's easy then to find the properties because they're in alphabetical order. And the properties for each object appear on, the name of the property appears on the left-hand side, and then the value assigned to that property is on the right-hand side, and you can change the values on the right. They're alphabetical, except for the very top. The name is in parentheses, so it always appears at the top. And we want to name our objects so that they are meaningful, and we need to name them if we refer to them in code. If you're not going to refer to an object in code, there's no need to name it. One word of caution here, I would say don't rename your form, especially your initial form. And all the projects we're going to start off with are going to be just one form or one window. We're going to leave it named Form 1. But we do want to change a couple things here. We're going to scroll down to the text property. And in our storyboard, we had given our window a title of SMCC Simple Calculator. So I'm going to type that into the left-hand side of the text property, so the right-hand side of the text property. And when I press the Enter key, you're going to see that reflected up here on the title bar of our window. You will also notice that there is a size property. There's a little plus sign to the left of the size, and that is because the size property is made up of two other properties, the width and the height. And you can see the width here is 816, the height is 489. You can change them combined here by entering in a new value. So we're going to make this 640, 480. And since this is visual C# and everything is visually represented, you'll see some handles at the bottom right corner, and the right-hand side. And I can grab these handles and I can resize my form. And if I do this, you'll notice that when I let go, it reflects this property size in the property window. I can grab the bottom handle, or I can grab the corner handle and move them both at the same time. So I can resize something visually, or again, I can come back in here and give it a size. And again, I'm going back to 640, 480. The form also has a back color property. When I click this property, I get a little chevron pointing down. This is going to open up some panels. And I have three tabs in this panel. I have custom, in which I get a bunch of swatches, and I can actually add more colors to that. I get the web defined colors, the named colors that browsers understand, or I can see what the system colors are set up for this particular computer, and these will change from user to user. I'm just going to go to the custom tab. We're going to make this light blue as our background. So we have the Solution Explorer, we have the Properties panel, and then over here on the left-hand side is our Toolbox. Now any one of these panels you can show and hide. There's a little auto hide push pin, and I can click that and it collapses over here on the side. I can open it back up. It's also a panel that I can move around, and I can dock these panels in locations on the left, right, bottom, or top. And I can resize the panels. So for now, we're going to look at the common controls. We're going to start with a label. I'm going to put the label across the top here. Labels are static text. The text does not change. The user cannot change it. We can change the text programmatically. Labels are often used to provide instructions, provide labels to other controls, though they can be used for output. One of the properties of a label, and by the way, since I have a label now selected, you see the little handle in the upper left-hand corner, I am now looking at the properties for that label. And this label has a name. It's called label 1. I'm just going to leave that. It has a back color property, which took the back color of our form. But there's one thing about labels, and that is there's an auto size property, which by default is set to true. Now you may have noticed when I took this label, in fact I'm going to delete this label just for a second. I'm going to select it and delete it. Let me draw another label. There's two ways to add the labels. I can drag the label onto the screen, or what I did, and you may have missed this earlier, is I took the label tool and I drew a box of where I wanted this label to be. And I wanted to have a little bit of space on the top left and right margins. But I want this label to go across the width. And you'll notice that when I let go of the mouse, it collapses back to just the small little label here. And that's because of this auto size property set to true. Typically, I like to set this to false. And you'll see now I get the label as I defined it when I drew it out. Labels have text. So the text is what is shown in the label. I'm going to delete this text, and then I'd already typed some text and copied it into Microsoft Word, so I'm just going to paste it. And this is simply my instructions to the user on how to use this program. I want that to be a little bit bigger, so there is a font property here. And for the font property, even though it's made up of multiple other properties, you can change all those in a font dialog by clicking the button to the far right of font with the three little periods, what we call ellipses. and it will open up a dialog. By the way, the 3 periods is a standard in computing, meaning that you will always have a dialog box if you choose that option. We often see that in Windows, that if I come over to the File menu and I were to choose Save Form 1 CS As, the 3 little periods after that means it's going to open a dialog box. Same with account settings, same with page setup and print. Okay, so I'm going to go back, bring up my dialog box. I want to make this a little bit bigger. We'll make it maybe 12 point. Let's do 11 point. And we'll make it bold. So there is our label. I want to change the text color, and that is in the 4 color property. So we have the back color for the background. The 4 color is going to be the text. I'm just going to make this a white value. Now in our storyboard, we had specified a couple text boxes for our values that the user is going to enter in. And again, I'm going to change the font of this to make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to do 18 bold. And refer to this in name, first num. And we give it a default value by changing the text. And I think in the example in the storyboard we set 12 as the default, and I can align that. For numbers, I like to align them to the right. I'm going to add a label above that, and the label text is going to be first number. And I'll drag that to position it in where I want it. I'm going to select that label, hold down the Shift key, and select the text box I created. I'm going to copy and paste. I'm going to change the text of this label to be second number. I'm going to change the text of that second text box to be a 5. And I'm going to set the name of this text box, going to the name property. We're going to call this one txt second num. I'm going to paste again, Control V, so I get a third pair. This one, I'm going to move to the far right, change the label text to say solution. And I'm going to delete the text that is there, just leaving it as a blank text field. We're going to create a label in between these. This label text is going to have an equal sign. And I want to make it big. So we'll change the font. And maybe something like 24 bold. Okay, that looks good. I'm going to take my pointer tool. I'm going to drag a box around those last 7 items that I created, so they're all selected. I'm just going to move them down a little bit. Then we're going to go to the button tool, and we're going to create a button. We want to name this button BTN Add. And the text of this button will simply be a plus sign. And again, I want to make that fairly big, so we're going to change the font to 24 point bold. Now I forgot to name my solution text box. I'm going to go back and select that and name that txt solution. All right, I'm going to take this button, I'm going to copy and paste it. This one will name BTN. And we'll change the text to be a minus sign. I'm going to paste the button again. So now I got a third button. This one will name btn multiply. And since our user probably thinks of the multiplication operator as an x, that's what we'll use. And we'll paste one more time. This one we're going to use a slash as our text. And our name will be btn divide. Okay, that is our interface for this simple calculator. I can move things around a little bit by dragging. I'm going to tighten everything up a little bit here. You can also use the arrow keys when you select something and nudge it 1 pixel at a time. If you hold down the shift key, you can nudge it 10 pixels at a time. Okay, so there is our interface. At this point, I'm going to go to the File menu and choose Save All. By the way, you'll see on the File menu there are Save Form 1 CS, Save Form 1 CS As, and Save All. My suggestion is always choose Save All. Avoid ever using the same Save Form 1.cs As. You don't want to rename that file, and you don't want to put it someplace else. It should always be kept with your project. If I could find a way to get rid of that option off the menu, I would. So that's our interface. So we've done our design work, we've created the interface, and now it's time to code it to do something. By the way, at this point it does do something. If we were to start this is this little arrow up here at the top with the start menu, compiles your project. It takes all of your source files and compiles them into a machine language that the Windows operating system will understand with .NET. Basically creating a binary file of zeros and ones and creating what we call an executable. That executable will pop up here, and the IDE basically grays out, and I can change the values in each of these areas. And I can click the buttons, but nothing happens. So that's what I mean by we now need to code it. We need to have it do something when we click each of these buttons. However, we do have a minimize, a maximize, and a close button. So if I were to click the maximize button, that's already been coded for us by default, and it goes to full screen. It toggles back to the defined version. By the way, I can stretch this out, and I can redefine the size. You can turn those features off. And if I maximize it and then toggle back, it'll go back to that redefined size. There's also a minimize button here. It's standard on all Windows. That minimizes it, puts it down the system tray, and I can then bring it back. As long as the project is running, I can't make any changes in the IDE. So to go back and code it, I need to close the project. I can do that by one of two ways. I can click the close button, or I can click this little red square back in the IDE, and that will stop debugging. Either way will work. And the IDE will no longer be grayed out. It will come back to the foreground. And I can continue to make changes. One thing I don't like is this X seems a little bit big compared to everything else. I'm going to make this into a smaller X. That looks much better to me. So let's start by coding the plus button, the btn add button. And what I want to have is a piece of code that runs when I click this button. And to get to that piece of code and to write that code, I merely need to double click with the pointer on this button. It's going to take me to the code editor. The code editor has some things already predefined for us. These are called directives up here at the top, these using statements. These allow us to draw from predefined methods. Everything in our project is the namespace. Remember we named it Simple Calculator CS? Well, that became our namespace. And this namespace is important as we begin to have bigger projects that might borrow from other projects. We created a form. We named it Form 1. And that is the class in which we will do all the work on this form. So everything will appear in this Form 1 class designation, which starts with this curly bracket and ends with this curly bracket. And everything we write should be indented between those two curly brackets, just like that is all indented between the curly bracket of our namespace and the ending curly bracket of our namespace. By default, we have a method here. This is called a constructor. It's going to create our form. So this is the first thing that's executed when we run our application. And it basically tells it to initialize the components. One of the things that's happened as you drew out all of that information here, drew out the labels and the buttons and the text boxes, was there was a file that was created for you that has all the code that defines these objects, where they're located, what their properties are, and so forth. By the way, to go back between the design mode and the code window is simply these tabs up here at the top. So when I double clicked on this btn add button, it created 4 lines of code for me inside the class named Form 1. And it created something called a private void method named btn underscore add click. That's the name it gave it by default. It took the name of the object, gave it an underscore, and then the event that it assumed we wanted to respond to. There are lots of different events that an object can respond to. A button typically responds to a click event. Then there's some things here in parentheses that are called parameters. At this point, we're not going to worry about what that is. Just know that it created this, what we call a stub, for the code to be executed when we click our btn add button. And like the other methods that we've seen and the classes that we've seen, it begins and ends with a set of curly brackets. And we would write our code in between those curly brackets. And that code would be indented just like public Form 1 has a piece of code named initialize component that is indented between the curly brackets. This indentation simply makes it more readable. If it's not indented, it'll still work. But you want to strive for your code being readable. So I'm going to write some code here. First line of code is going to be double. I'm going to say num1, num2, solution. This creates 3 variables named num1, num2, and solution in memory. I'm then going to assign a value to num1. And I'm going to get the value that the user has entered into txt first num. And you remember, we entered that text into the text property. So I'm going to pull a value from that text property, and I'm running it in a method called double.parse. What that's going to do is it's going to convert the text, which is a string data type, into a variable of type double. It's basically creating text values into numeric values. Now, everything in C# as far as statements need to be concluded with a semicolon. And by the way, everything is case sensitive when you're typing into C#. So you have to watch your uppercase and lowercase. For example, if I made this num2 and I said equals double.parse txt second num.text, I'm going to change this to an uppercase N. Notice I get a little red squiggly underneath num2. It does not know what num2 is because I didn't define it. I defined num2 with a lowercase n as being a double variable. As soon as I get rid of that, change that to a lowercase, that squiggly goes away, as does the green squiggly under num2, which basically says you haven't used this yet. So red squigglies are really bad. Green squigglies are kind of warnings. Your program will still work with the green squiggly. But you want to watch for these red squigglies as you write code. That tells you something is not understandable by the compiler. So my next process here is, let's take solution. Solution is going to equal num1 plus num2. We're going to do a little math. This is the add button. So we're going to add those two numbers together, put that in the value of solution, and then I want to display the solution in our txt solution text box. I'm going to display it in the text property. And I'm going to display solution back as a string because the text property is expecting a string value. And solution is a double value. I get a little red squiggly at the end because I haven't put in my semicolon yet. Now in the toString, I'm going to specify this as having, we'll say all of our answers should have 2 decimal places. So I'm going to put a quote in 2 inside those parentheses. That's an optional value, but this will format everything to have 2 decimal places. I'm going to test this to see if it worked. So we're going to go Start. I'm going to click the plus button, the add button, and I get 17.00. That worked. 12 plus 5 should be 17. If I want to have this just be 1 decimal place, change that 2 to a 1, and I get 17.0. I'm going to code the other buttons the same way. So let's do the subtraction button. I'm going to double click on it. I get a method, starts with private void. By the way, the void means that nothing is returned. We'll talk about that further down the road. But here's the name of my method, btn subtract underscore click. And to make things simple, I'm going to copy this code and paste it. And the only thing I need to change here is this plus sign to a minus sign. I'm going to test that. 12 minus 5 is 7. Okay, I'm going to come back here. I'm going to double click the multiplication, and I'll go back and double click the division. And again, I'm just going to paste the code that we wrote from before. Change the multiplication here from plus to an asterisk, which is the symbol for multiplication in programming languages. Do the same thing over here on the btn divide underscore click. I'm going to change the plus sign to a division symbol, which is the forward slash. And I'm going to test those two. So we've seen that the add and the subtract button works. How about the multiply button? So 12 times 5 should give us 60. And then 12 divided by 5 should give us 2.4. So these now all work. I can change these values. Let's try maybe 20 divided by 5 gives us 4. 20 times 5 gives us 100. Maybe 20 times 10 gives us 200. 20 divided by 10 is 2. Subtracting 10 from 20 gives us 10, and 20 plus 10 gives us 30. Everything seems to be working. So always want to test your program very thoroughly, make sure everything's working, and you probably want to know what the desired output should be based on the values that you're providing so it can test that it's accurate. I'm going to close my project. One last thing I want to look at is this whole project folder. I'm going to go to Windows Explorer, and I'm going to go find my project where I saved it. So here's my folder of Simple Calculator. I'm going to open that up, and you'll see that what we have in here is our solution file, the .sln. If I were to close Visual Studio, I want to come back and work on this again. This is the file I'd want to open. If I come in and just double click on that SLN file, it will launch Visual Studio and open my project. Then there's a folder here called Simple Calculator CS. I'm going to open up that folder. Inside that folder are 3 other folders and a bunch of other files. These are some of those source files, and you'll notice here we have our form1.cs and our form1 designer.cs. So that was our interface in our code. This resx file is a resource file. I want to go into the bin folder. In the bin folder is a debug folder. Inside that folder is the executable file that was created when we tested our project, when we compiled it. It created this exe. And you could take this exe and you can simply double click on it. It will launch your project. But you can also take this exe and send it to somebody or put it on somebody else's machine. And if they're running Windows, they should be able to launch it and run it. I'm going to go back to the File menu, choose Save All, and I can then exit Visual Studio. Now again, if I wanted to come back and open that project again, I can go into find my folder where the project is, find the SLN file. You might want to show your extensions in Windows Explorer so you see that .sln. I'm going to double click on that. That's going to launch Visual Studio and open up my project. Oftentimes when you open a project, you'll see something like this. You're wondering, where did my file go? Where's my interface? And you have to come over here and double click on the form1cs file. And there's your project. If you want to get to the code, you can simply double click on one of the buttons and you're back into the code.